Today's episode is brought to you by Charles Russell Speechleys. Charles Russell Speechleys is an international law firm with a special focus on private capital at the intersection of personal, family and business interests. With origins dating back to the 1800s, the firm has a long-standing reputation for building strong, trusted relationships with their clients. These relationships are crafted to deliver meaningful value and, like Charles Russell Speechleys, are designed to stand the test of time. In a world that is constantly changing, the steadfast, long-term relationships that Charles Russell Speechleys builds with their clients remains a constant. To learn more about their services and how they can help you, please visit www.charlesrussellspeechleys.com. Hi, I'm Violet Manners and welcome to Hidden Heritage, the podcast that brings you inside Great Britain's most fascinating destinations with help from custodians, historians, artisans and experts. This week, I'm delighted to be joined by Dr Tristram Hunt, historian, writer, former Member of Parliament and the director of the Victoria and Albert Museum. Since taking up his role in 2017, Tristram has championed design education in UK schools, led debates around the history of museums' global collections, and overseen the transformation of the V&A into a multi-site institution. Under his leadership, the V&A now includes 6 UK venues, from its iconic Kensington home to the V&A Wedgwood Collection, V&A Dundee and Young V&A, with the up-and-coming V&A East Storehouse and V&A East Museum set to open in 2025 this year and 2026. So on today's episode, we'll be discussing Tristram's fascinating journey from academia to politics to leading one of the world's most renowned cultural institutions. We'll explore the role of museums in preserving and interpreting heritage, the challenges facing cultural institutions today, and how we can ensure that historic spaces remain relevant and accessible in the 21st century. Tristram, it's such a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us on Hidden Heritage. I've given our listeners a very brief introduction to you, but how do you define yourself and the work that you do?
I'm a museum director, and I have the privilege of leading one of the greatest museums in the world, the V&A. And one of the extraordinary things about the V&A is when you do go around the world is how many institutions, from the Tokyo Palace Museum to the Metropolitan Museum of Art to Philadelphia, are inspired by the history of South Kensington and look to South Kensington as this remarkable institution which has kind of led the way in museums. And the collection here, as we'll come on to discuss, is just so fabulous. So museum director is what I am.
So Tristram, what first sparked your love for history? Was there a particular book, place or moment that set you on this fascinating path that you've been on?
I was very lucky. I had a superb teacher when I was young, when I was 11, 12, called Mr. McIntosh. And he was my history teacher, and he taught us in great gruesome depth the Battle of Agincourt. And then in even more gruesome depth, we studied Friedrich Engels's celebrated work on the state of industrial Manchester in the 1840s, the condition of the working class in England. And so week by week, we'd go through the terrible kind of immiseration and the loss of limbs in, cotton factories, and the horror of kind of typhus and typhoid, and that feel for the drama of the past, all of while he was trying to quite rightly inculcate us in strong left-wing values about the immiseration of the proletariat. And so he sparked in me this kind of great wonder of the past, and much later I'd write a biography of Engels. And then I had another great teacher called Terry Morris, who taught me how to write essays and introduced me to early modern Europe, and brilliantly taught the English Civil War as well. So I was very lucky.
Where was school for you? Where was
So that was at University College School
Okay.
in North London. Very, very inspiring teachers then.
So your book, 10 Cities That Made an Empire, explores how urban centres shaped the British Empire. How do cities, to your mind now, serve as living museums of history and heritage?
So 10 Cities That Made an Empire was really taking some of that thinking about urban culture and then developing it in a colonial and imperial context. So tracing the history of the British Empire, not through battles and wars and acquisitions, but actually through the urban cultures, which were often much more complex. I mean, these were places where you had exchange and multiculturalism and adaptation. It wasn't just, as it were, the straightforward colonial footprint. So you can trace, as we all know, the history of countries through their urban areas and their urban settings. And for me, again, the architecture, the street planning, the culture of that was a way into that history. And so whether it was Calcutta or Bombay or Bridgetown, Barbados, it was hopefully a more nuanced way of thinking about empire through cities.
That's really interesting. As opposed to sort of, because I guess we're also used to thinking about it as it relates to, it's foreign, it's foreign, engagement, I guess.
Yes, and also hopefully sort of going beyond that idea of good or bad in terms of the history of empire, because cities are complicated, and you've got indigenous communities, you've got foreign communities, you've got the mix there, and so it's a way of seeing that empires are often brutal and bloody and exploitative, but they're also places of hybridity and multiculturalism and exchange, and that takes place in cities. Yeah. And the flip side of that was thinking, well, you can't really think about Liverpool or London in the 19th century without thinking those are also imperial cities who are affected by what's happening around the world. So cities as these places of kind of reflexiveness was what I was seeking to unpick.
That's so interesting. And you, Tristram, just to sort of cycle back to your childhood, you were born in Cambridge, and you come from a sort of long line of family members that have been involved in, politics. So your father was a meteorologist, I believe, and Labour peer. And then your grandfather, Roland Hunt, served as a British diplomat. So do you think that kind of, also inspired your kind of curiosity around empire, but in a slightly more sort of localized way?
Definitely. My grandparents' house was full of the paraphernalia of imperial officialdom of a certain period. The elephant dustbin, the kind of figurines from Chennai. You felt that connection to that, and my father was born in India in a hill station, but you have to put yourself beyond that as a historian. My grandfather was also a tax collector for the British Empire, and so that thinking about the history of empire and thinking about history was definitely in the family. But I think then as a historian you have to try to disassociate. You can never fully, but you have to try and disassociate yourself from it to a degree.
I think that's why I'd make a terrible historian, because I'm fascinated so much in roots.
It's very hard.
That's a very good point. And you've obviously spent years writing about history and making it accessible through the work that you've done both at the South Kensington V&A Museum, which, dare I say, also I should add, we're actually in the V&A right now in South Kensington, in Tristram's office. But indeed, you've actually really sought to sort of expand the V&A's footprint. And is that, how do you approach storytelling? And whether it's books, exhibitions, or dare I say, the political speeches that you would have done in your time as well. How do you approach storytelling? And is that a sort of innate thing, or is that something you've learned through the course of being a historian?
I think you pick up this real difference, having been a historian and lectured in history and taught history, and being in a museum. And historians seek to create a narrative. You seek to draw points together and have an appreciation of process over time. And in the museum you start with the object. You begin with the object, the history of the object, the provenance, the material, and then you build outwards. So it's definitely a different mindset, being a historian versus being a curator, I think. But within all of that, and what I've always been very passionate about, is then how do you tell that to the public? How do you bring the public into that incredible knowledge? And we touched on the fact that you were last here and you saw the Great Moguls exhibition, telling the story of Akbar and Jahangir and Shah Jahan and that incredible period of Mughal design, art and architecture, which is very foreign to us today. So how are you bringing now tens of thousands of people to come in and see that through the power and wonder of object and design and storytelling and interpretation? And that's what my colleagues here at the V&A are so brilliant at.
Yeah, true specialism. And I think, the exhibition you just mentioned that I luckily got to see a few weeks ago, but it's so interesting. I think what I really noticed when I'm walking around that exhibition was exactly that. You have you've got the collections themselves, which have no doubt taken many years to sort of gather and group together. But then you've also, there's an architectural element. You've actually built some of, sort of emblematic examples of, Indian architecture in the exhibition space, which really just helps it, bring the whole thing to life.
I think people want that immersive sensibility.
Yes.
You when you go into an exhibition, you want to be taken into a different realm, and that might be at the Tate at the moment, kind of Lee Bowery Club World in 1980s London, or it might be Agra in the 17th century, and that helps in a sort of showmanship way bring the objects to life as well. And if you can provide the scholarship, the design experience, the objects, and tell a story through it, then you're on your way, I think, to creating a great exhibition.
Totally. So as you know, Tristram, we ask every one of our guests who joins us on the show to share with us 3 of their must-visit heritage sites in the United Kingdom. And so I'm going to jump into that section very briefly now and ask you for your first recommendation as to where, what is a must-see historical or heritage site?
Well, as you said, I was very privileged to be Member of Parliament for Stoke-on-Trent
Yep.
for 7 years. And as we sit in my director's office, you can see the Wedgwood blue and white ware
Yes.
on the wall. And so my first heritage stop is not actually the Barlaston factory of Wedgwood, but in the mother town of Stoke-on-Trent, Burslem, the Middleport pottery, which still to this day makes burley-ware on copper-printed transfers. And it's still one of the great pottery sites in North Staffordshire. So if you want a feel for the meaning of the potteries and Stoke-on-Trent and ceramics, Middleport pottery in Burslem, I think is the place to go. It's got a wonderful shop as well. It's got a very nice cafe. You're right next to the canal, which teaches you about how the clay would come in and the ware would then go out. And you have a sense of the kind of processes of production. The Gladstone Museum in Stoke is very good as well, but Middleport would be my suggestion. And I think they filmed the first or second edition of the Great Pottery Throwdown there as well. So people will be familiar with it.
Okay. And I guess just for listeners that don't know, will you just give us a tiny sort of history of Stoke as it relates to China and pottery? Just
Yes,
for listeners
I mean,
abroad
it's
that maybe
very
don't know.
dangerous to ask that. But essentially, in the early mid-18th century, the combination of clay and coal came together to allow for this valley in North Staffordshire, which had been producing ceramics for a while, to massively accelerate production through new energy sources. Once the coal was firing the kilns, and you were able to begin to produce ceramics in a much more industrial quantities, that just lit the fire for Stoke-on-Trent, becoming the potteries. And there are very few places in the world which are named after their industry. Motor City, Detroit is one of them, and the potteries in North Staffordshire is another. And so out of that comes Wedgwood and Spode and Minton and Moorcroft and all of these great ceramic
Iconic names.
businesses.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I think that's an amazing place to start, and also love that it sort of fits in with your own personal history as well, and the journey you've been on. So now we're going to move into the present and actually talk about your career today and how your work here at the V&A since 2017, when you became the director, has and is evolving the very history of the V&A that we sit in today, and indeed its sort of sister sites. So you've had, to some degree, an unconventional career journey. You from historian to MP to museum director. What's been your biggest challenge in each of those roles to date?
You definitely think differently in each role. Hopefully you bring out some experiences and insights from different periods. So whether that's as a historian, understanding the meaning of this place, South Kensington, created out of the Great Exhibition of 1851. So having done my doctorate on the Victorian period, understanding what good Prince Albert, whose portrait is staring down at us, Henry Cole, the founding director, what they wanted to do from this institution, that gave me an insight. Having been a politician, understanding how people seek to make decisions, how you manage constituencies, how you manage conflicts of interest is an insight, and also an appreciation that national institutions like the V&A, paid for by taxpayers from across the country, have this national role, and we need to fulfill that and be transparent about that. Here at the V&A, hopefully what I brought to the role was some of that historical appreciation and also some of that political insight, as well as a deep commitment to kind of opening up the collections and reasserting the vision of the V&A in terms of design and design education. And that's been a particular project over the last years.
Yeah, because the V&A Museum is fundamentally dedicated, as you just said, to design and creativity, historical and, present. How do you think design shapes heritage, and what role does, craftsmanship play in how we understand the past?
I think, when you hold something like a Grinling Gibbons lime wood carved cravat in your hand and feel just the incredible dexterity and skill and how that kind of haptic sort of connection to the past, there's something totally wondrous about the object to throw you back. And you can tell the story of a city, a country, a nation, an empire, partly through design, not totally, but partly through design and either the economics of that, the cultural trends of that. So the V&A is, we're not a museum of British history, we're not a museum of colonial history. We're a museum of art, design and performance, telling the story of creativity. But within that, you necessarily tell the story of Regency Britain. You necessarily tell the story of Mughal India. Absolutely. You tell the story of Qing China. You come to those periods, but through a framing around material culture, the makers, the artisans, the artists. And hopefully what we also do, and this is a big role for us, is provide inspiration for today's makers and artists and craftsmen and designers. That's always been our role, which is slightly distinct to some of our colleagues in other institutions. People will always be inspired by collections, but we've got this specific function to encourage contemporary designers and artists.
And I guess, in today's world, museums around the world have often faced, in more recent years, difficult conversations around, contested heritage and restitution. And I guess when you're looking at, history through the lens of creativity and design, it does imbue this sense of understanding. You're not attacking it from a sort of particular angle. So I guess the V&A is in quite a unique position to sort of address those quite contentious conversations, but through a language that we all kind of appreciate and can kind of get into those difficult conversations more easily through. Would you say, or is that not been the case so much here?
No, I think that's a very good way of framing it, because we have material looted, for example, from Kumasi in modern-day Ghana during the Anglo-Ashanti Wars of 1874. So this is loot. And we need to describe that and be transparent and scholarly around that. But it was also the product of incredible traditions of design and goldsmithing in the Ashanti communities. And there were makers behind these objects. So people today want to know about the provenance of objects, how they came into the museum. They are interested in that history. But we should never lose sight within that of the maker and the designer and the artist. So the displays we had didn't just say, this is loot from 1874 and this was part of imperial history. It also spoke about the way in which artists and designers in London in the 1880s were then inspired by this material, as well as that imperial history. And now those objects are actually back on display in Kumasi in the Mancha Palace Museum. So I think we need to be open and transparent and scholarly above all about the history, but also do that in a V&A way, which speaks about the art and design connected to the objects as well.
Yeah. Well, and I think from the few exhibitions that I've seen, it's something that's, you can really feel that sense of the sensitivity through which you've displayed it, but equally the total transparency, which I think is appreciated, because ultimately, everyone I think everyone appreciates that kind of level of transparency when it comes to the past, albeit it has to be done very sensitively.
Yeah. And the past is complicated, and it's not. And actually, the more research we have, that the history of objects becomes more complicated. So it's not kind of stuck in a moment.
And I guess we're in this sort of incredible new sort of industrial-esque revolution of technology, and the digital era that we now live in with AI is so sort of rapidly evolving. But I guess that also potentially is quite exciting when it comes to places like the V&A, and indeed, dare I say, historic houses around the country as well, about how they actually sort of use this sort of new digital innovation to really bring collections, really bring the experience of visiting somewhere like the V&A to life in a newfounded way.
I think we're finding our way in terms of AI, as we all are. I mean, there are obvious business practices connected to it, which we'll use for efficiency. There are hopefully some real advantages in terms of digital access to the collections and thinking about collections management and managing all that. And then we've also got this great tradition in the museum of collecting digital materials. So we've been collecting digital art since the 1960s. So there's a kind of lineage of thinking right up to AI. And we have now, with great kind of ethical boundaries, started to think about what AI images or pieces we're going to collect. Mm-hmm. But I think also the response to AI and synthetic reality and virtual reality is the power and wonder of the object as well, and the real object, and being to see it for yourself. And I was just looking at some mosque lamps from 17th century Turkey and Syria, and seeing those and the glasswork and the craftsmanship and the skill for yourself, and the wonder of that still today is hugely powerful. So I think museums don't need to be, too kind of fretful about this.
Mm-hmm. And afraid of sort of it ever replacing the real thing and the real experience. And Tristram, the V&A has expanded so significantly under your leadership, becoming a multi-site museum. What does this evolution mean for its future, and sort of what's next? Will you tell us a little bit about what's coming later this year and next?
So, I mean, it has been a big period of expansion. I mean, obviously we've had the Bethnal Green Museum, which is now Young V&A. I mean, that's been there since 1872. So there's always been that.
God, I didn't know.
As the Bethnal Green Museum, it was always a kind of East End component of the V&A, and it went through various different forms, and now Young V&A. Mm-hmm. V&A Dundee opened very, very successfully 2018 as Scotland's design museum. The V&A Wedgwood collection, that's been there in one form or another since 2014, since the Wedgwood collection was saved, but now free to enter. We're investing much more in programming, archiving the collection. But the big shift is the coming 18 months, when we'll open V&A East Storehouse, which is this new facility on the Olympic Park, which gives open access to the V&A reserve collections. You'll know museum directors or those in charge of historic houses, I always ask, where have you hidden all the other stuff? Well, now we can show you. So everyone can go and see all the other stuff for themselves in a kind of semi-curated way. So it's not gallery level, but you get a kind of rough and ready idea of what a collection centre looks like. And we've built some wonderful historic rooms there, which we've had in storage. So we put much more on display. And then this time next year, we open V&A East Museum, again on the Olympic Park, which is focused on 16 to 24-year-olds around traditions of making and design, drawing on East London's traditions in this area, but also global trends. And, then we're really going to be put to the test to see if the young ones do like objects, because as well as the programming and other components. Yeah.
And I guess, places like V&A Dundee, I mean, was that a huge sort of risk or like worry, to take, setting something up?
Well, we're part of a partnership there. So we're with the Scottish Government, we're with the Dundee City Council, with the two universities. So actually it's a collaboration. But it's now evolving in different ways under its great director, Leonie Bell, But it was a risk, that extension, but it's done what it needs to do, not only in terms of kind of really great programming and the collections, but giving Dundee the pathway to a slightly new direction in terms of regeneration, in terms of business development, more people's, as tourists. So that kind of economic regeneration has been a big part of it.
And I mean, we'll come on to that later, but I personally am so fascinated in how heritage museums, collections are such enormous instigators of, this economic kind of shift for so many rural towns and cities, which is so important and not to be overseen or overshadowed. But how, so a question that I've definitely always had, because I'm afraid to say I didn't spend a lot of time when I was younger going to museums. I've got much more interested as I've got older. But how does your team here go decide which exhibitions to curate, and what factors there or influences the selection process for them?
So we have a great committee called the Exhibition Steering Group, which is you don't enjoy every meeting, but that's always
why, because there's great debate.
No, I mean, sorry, you don't enjoy going to every committee in this organisation, but the Exhibition Steering Group is one you enjoy going to, because it's a really interesting debate about. Because by the time ideas get there, they've been through multiple. They're all good ideas, and you'd want to do all of them. And part of my job, almost like a newspaper editor with colleagues on Exhibition Steering Group, is thinking about the mix of exhibitions. So at the moment, we've just closed our Jamil Prize exhibition, which was about really contemporary digital works from the Middle East, drawing on Islamic traditions. We've got the Great Moguls exhibition open, and we've got Naomi Campbell in fashion. Then we're going to open Cartier in a few weeks' time, and then we've got an exhibition on design and disability, so the disabled communities, design, a narrative over the last half century. So you want that kind of mix. For a museum like the V&A, and we get about 45% of our income from the government, the rest is self-generated. We've also got to have a commercially successful exhibition program, but it can't be too commercial. We're not a theme park. We're not a kind of place for hire. There's got to be the scholarship and understanding behind it. So mixing collection types, geographies, commercial, more scholarly, all of those components coming together to creating a program. And some years work well and some years less well.
But overall, I mean, the V&A's numbers, particularly in South Kent at least, I'm sure, are sort of doing this, aren't they? And have been for several years.
We're almost back to where we were pre-COVID. So we had it's slightly unfair on us, because we had a spectacular year pre-COVID when we had the Christian
thank goodness
Dior.
You did, though.
I know. We had the Christian Dior Designer of Dreams exhibitions, and we hit about 3.5 million visitors here at South Kensington, another 500,000 at Young V&A. So we're almost 4 million. And now this year we'll probably end at about 3.4 million at South Kensington. So we're building back, but it's not easy.
No, and your visitors obviously come from, I'm imagining, all over the world. There's not a sort of particular kind of country that ends up sort of spending more time in the V&A than another.
So we're around, again, 45% foreign visitors and 55% UK visitors, and definitely in the immediate aftermath of Brexit, we saw a sharp fall of European visitors and more American, Australian, Canadian. Now, thankfully, our European friends and visitors are returning in good numbers. And from the UK, London and the Southeast more than across the rest of the UK. And we do need to do kind of more work to bring in across UK visitors. But that's partly, we can do so much, but that's partly, as we know, the nightmare of trains, the cost of travel. So as it were, we can be super attractive. What we did find, there was this lovely moment last summer when Taylor Swift was having all her concerts, and we had the Taylor Swift Trail through the museum, which was 13 looks from Taylor across different parts of the museum, reflecting to the collections. And we had tens of thousands from across the country
I
come and see
bet.
that, because they were coming down to Wembley to go to the Taylor Swift concert, and they'd come here first and see the looks. And it was people who'd never been to the V&A before. They didn't know what the V&A was. They didn't know where it was. And they came here and it was great.
Well, interestingly, as a sort of anecdote, Taylor Swift also had a huge impact on so many of our historic houses that are on Heritage Explore, sort of up and down the country, because they were sort of, and I think they were calling it the kind of generational travel. The grandparents were taking the children to see sort of Taylor Swift in Manchester, and then they wanted to go and see a historic house afterwards in the sort of local. So she had an impact up and down the country, it seems.
Yeah, the Taylor Swift
effect.
heritage impact, exactly.
Quite niche, but nevertheless very appreciated, I think, from all sides. But so I think that sort of segues really nicely onto, like, you know, is there a tension between attracting, from your point of view as the director here, and indeed across the, you know, the scope of the sister sites to some degree, you know, is there a tension between attracting that younger, broader, you know, dare I say, more diverse audience, and maintaining the support of traditional sort of historic design, creative heritage enthusiasts? Is that a tension that you've felt at all I guess when it comes to curating the collections or the exhibitions?
Yeah, definitely. And you've got to, but that's the responsibility, and that's the kind of leadership point, that you've got to manage that. And you can't be, you could go down an avenue which is very niche and very commercially successful, but you're really not fulfilling your mandate as a cultural institution. And also you can kind of get to the end of that run, and you're not regenerating yourselves for the next generation, who are then, you know, thinking about this place. So, you know, we have Friday Lates at the end of last Friday of the month, which we basically hand the museum over to young artist collectives, to poets, to DJs, to artists, to dancers. And this place has a different feel and a different demographic. Some of our, you know, people coming to see, you know, Naomi, or people who came to see our Elton John photography show, you know, are different to some who will come and see other exhibitions. So you've got to have that mix, I think, but also it just to feel sort of friendly and open and accessible to everyone. And what you have to work harder, and you'll know about this, is just removing those kind of hidden social and cultural barriers to entry that are hard, frankly, for me to pick up as you know, who I am, but are these sort of almost sort of hidden, sometimes class barriers to entry that you have to ensure people just feel welcome and a sense of ownership and engagement.
Yeah. And especially so at somewhere as iconic as here, because I guess there must also be a tension around, you know, how much do you want to challenge a visitor and their thinking versus how much do you want to, you know, simply delight them and make them feel kind of very welcomed. Is that sort of, you know, something that goes through everyone's minds on the committee?
Yeah, definitely. And this is a big place with, you know, we probably, in the museum today, we've probably got around 65,000 objects on display. We've got 7 miles of corridors, we always say. And there are different rhythms across the galleries and exhibitions. So there'll be some which are, you know, really, you know, intellectually demanding about the history of the object and the meaning of it. And, you know, people will get great pleasure from that. We've got a brilliant display in our galleries at the moment on the history of British studio pottery and the history of the Arts Council and the V&A connected to that, and Lucy Ree, and, you know, it's brilliant. And you'll learn a great deal from it. We've also got our superb jewellery gallery, which is an immersive, wonderful experience as well. And yes, the labels will tell you about the, you know, the origins of the gemstones and the history of design, but people will also just enjoy that as a kind of pleasurable aesthetic moment. So I think you can do both. And in exhibitions, the best exhibitions challenge you, educate you, but also kind of entertain and enrich you at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah. And I, you know, just again, sorry to cycle back to, you know, historic house for a second, but do you ever see a future or a moment in which, like, museums, and maybe more especially the V&A to some degree, but museums and historic houses work more collaboratively to tell the sort of fuller, more connected stories that you know, are definitely exist to some degree?
Definitely, and I think there's more to be done there. There are always kind of institutional and financial challenges around this. we have lots of material on loan to historic houses, whether it's Chippendale tables up at Harwood, whether it's something incredible, the official, whether it's the silk hangings, and I think it's almost the bed of state, the Walpole bed at Halton. We're connected to many of these houses, and we work closely with the National Trust. Lots of material on loan there. So there's definitely connections to be developed there, and where you have connections between the collections, during the kind of the great sales of the houses, the V&A would pick up, lots of material, and now the houses are being more confident. The Duke of Bedford is desperate to get the Three Graces back, but so there are these areas of partnership and connection which we could probably do more work on.
Yeah, I think it would be fascinating. And just for our listeners who don't understand why and what you mean by they're on loan, what you mean is that sort of at one moment in time, by most likely by virtue of inheritance tax and death tax, a house would have essentially the V&A would have purchased that item and then kept it in its sort of place, but fundamentally the V&A owns it. Or can you just explain for the listeners what that means?
Yes, so essentially it was to retain objects which were commissioned in a site-specific way. By great artists and designers of the past in those historic houses, whilst the houses dealt with death duties and inheritance tax. So it's acceptance in lieu of tax in situ. So they remain there. And we also have to get this balance right, because at some point we're landed with all the costs of conservation and restoration, whilst the owners of the houses enjoy all the objects and the and the kind of tourism connected to it. So we had to, now what we seek is an endowment connected to it, because we have lifetime responsibility for these objects without them being in our galleries or now that's fine. We're here for the nation. We kind of get it, but the finances of that sometimes need to be managed more equitably.
I can see that, but equally, I think dare I say, all of these houses are definitely not getting 4 million visitors like the V&A. So I think if they go some way to sort of drawing people to these rural economies and historic places, I think that must be, something of huge pride for the museum more broadly. So I always ask my guests, if you could bring back one last lost artifact from history, what would it be and why?
There are some dinner services from Wedgwood. There's part of the great Catherine the Great service, which was commissioned, the frog service, which was commissioned for Catherine the Great. Most of which is we know the whereabouts, but there are parts of that which are missing. But I think actually the one your predecessors, other contributors had probably said this as well. We had a superb Fabergé exhibition here, and the missing Fabergé eggs are always always most. And we put on display in the exhibition one egg which had been found at a car boot sale in, I think, like Iowa or something, which was then acquired, and then the provenance was established, and the vetting was done, and it came back to life. So I think some of the lost Fabergé eggs of the late 19th, early 20th century would be a special item, and then you could have the greatest Fabergé exhibition, which brings them all together as one.
That would be magical. This is just a quick reminder. You're listening to Hidden Heritage with me, Violet Manners. It's been a fascinating conversation so far with Tristram. He's explored and shared his love of history, where it came from, his role at the V&A Museum, and indeed his past life as a politician. And now we're going to move on to my next and most treasured part of every conversation I have on this podcast. We get to start hearing about his second recommendation and indeed what's happening at the V&A day to day today. We're going to move on to your second heritage recommendation, heritage or historic place or site recommendation for our listeners, please.
So I was wrestling with this. I was thinking either Eastner Eastnor Castle, not least because we've got this excellent Pugin display on at the moment. And obviously, Pugin did so much in terms of the Gothic revival, the drawing room at Eastnor and his work with the family there. And they're restoring it so brilliantly, and the Harvey Bathurst look after that site so well. And if you want to understand the history of design in the late 18th, 19th century, Eastnor is part of it. But I think ultimately it's going to be the Temple of Worthies at Stowe, because if you to have an understanding of, in a sense, a Tory tradition and the kind of almost a radical Tory tradition of Britain and the meaning of Britain in the 18th century and afterwards. And it's no one goes there. Right. And you have this idea of what Britain was. So it's Shakespeare and it's Elizabeth and it's Pym and it's Hampden, and it's an account of the meaning of Britain through this garden, which is designed as a work of political philosophy, which is in itself remarkable. Mm-hmm. And then obviously it's sort of living through the school in some ways as well.
Yeah.
It's incredibly hard to get to on public transport. You have to get a bus, which rarely goes from Milton Keynes station. But when you get there, it's worth it.
Okay, that's a real treat actually for our listeners, and that sounds like a really great one that we have not had before. So thank you for sharing that with us. And in a recent FT piece, you described the British Country House as a contested space, and I'd love to know what you meant by that, and why is it important that we keep them open to interrogation and conversation?
I spoke at the Historic Houses Association
yes, I was there,
AGM,
yeah.
Which was really interesting, actually. And I think and so many houses are there, rather like the museum. You've got to keep them engaged with contemporary conversation to remain relevant, because each new generation brings to it a new perspective and understanding. And the transformation we saw a generation ago in terms of the social history of houses, which is, people are now much more interested in, the kind of buttery and the kitchen and the servants' quarters than the staterooms. There's that kind of shift has taken place.
I think that's partly down to the success of a show like Downton Abbey, the upstairs, downstairs.
Downstairs, absolutely. But all of that great work by the National Trust as well in the 70s, thinking about that. And now people are interested in the global history of these houses. And this is, for academics, quite familiar territory over the last 30 years, but it's now making its way much more readily through the historic houses. And people want to know, to my mind, the provenance of objects, where the money came from, the global trade flows, the kind of multicultural stories of design. And this isn't, as it were, kind of, exercise in sort of token wokery. It's actually a rigorous historical exercise which positions these houses, which grew exponentially in the 18th and 19th century through global trade flows, within this history. And I think today people are interested in that. And, I was at Shugborough, when was it, 6-9 months ago, and telling the story of China and the East India Company going, into this remarkable house in quite a kind of lonely part of Staffordshire. Well, that's hugely interesting. So I think there's work to open that up and to lean into it.
Yeah. And I mean, I've found as well in recent years that actually there's also a desire for escapism. And I think that it kind of almost went too far one way, sort of make it overly academic, the experience of visiting these places. And I think to some degree post-COVID, we all think, for God's sake, let's just get into a beautiful space. Very often we're sitting looking at a screen all day, or the majority of us are. And then actually when you then get an opportunity to stand in a beautiful, state dining room or dare I say, the Great Hall in the V&A, there's that sense of sort of just wonder and escapism that I think we all just want to slightly be allowed to sort of escape into, and without too much explanation, without too much kind of academia or dare I say kind of, cultural heritage being called to question. Whilst it definitely needs to be recognised and acknowledged, I don't know, it's a delicate balance, but we've seen that a lot with the people that are booking, through our platform now to go to these historic houses, they definitely tend to just want to have the experience of looking up and looking out and looking at a new landscape and vista, and not, so I think it's delicate, isn't it? The whole thing.
And the great thing is you can do both.
Well, exactly.
One of the sadnesses that took place at the National Trust, I think, was, and it was a COVID thing which then didn't come back. You always used to have those wonderful folders in the corner. So if you were the nerdy person who wanted to know about the lacquerware, you could read sort of, 5 paragraphs about it. So I think people can go to Eastner and just immerse themselves in the beauty of it. And beauty is important, and beauty is enhancing and enriching. And you don't want everything covered in labels, telling you,
what's what,
all the, where all the wood came from. But you can also have that for those who are interested and engaged in it,
totally.
as part of it. And I think people are interested in it. So I think you're right that people do want a degree of escapism, immersion, but I think stewards of great houses or museums like this also have that educational and civic responsibility to chart out the history and meaning of it as well.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I guess you mentioned contemporary art and design to re-energize these spaces. Have you seen any particularly sort of exciting examples at historic houses, maybe more specifically over the kind of course of the last years?
I mean, seeing kind of Magdalena Odondu and the Gormley at Houghton was, and David Rock Savage is brilliant at this, and the transformations there. I think obviously Chatsworth did very well. I think Goodwood are now doing a sculpture park. I know kind of Eastner are thinking. I think there are lots of spaces which are thinking about this in a sense, as they should, because they were always
patrons of the arts
and patrons of contemporary artists. And I think what we're seeing, at Chatsworth in terms of the exhibition program there is really impressive as well. So it's there, and I think that's the right response, because there is a particularly again for younger generations, there's real interest, and people follow names, and you know all this much better than me, but in a kind of Instagram world, as it were, people are attracted to these kind of events and immersions and experiences in ways that they weren't in the past.
And what do you believe is sort of the biggest challenges facing museums in the future and heritage institutions in the years to come?
I mean, in the UK, we do face a real challenge around public funding, and that's been falling over time. I think if you compare and contrast the state of our galleries and infrastructure to what you see on the European continent or in the American museums, we risk falling behind in the absence of a charging entry, and we at the V&A don't want to do that. So there is a real just kind of, it's hidden stuff that you can't necessarily fundraise for, that provide the kind of pathway through. But I'm fairly confident about museum. The British Museum just posted 6.5 million visitors last year. You see what's happening at the Louvre. You see our own figures. I think again in this age of algorithmic determinism, as it were, the serendipity of museums is really powerful. We're not telling you if you like this, you'll like that. Actually, come and wander, and you could go from the Korean gallery to 19th century photographs of provincial France, to the cast courts, and so that serendipity, that joy, that kind of haptic wonder is really important.
And sorry to interrupt you, but dare I say awe? I think awe is something that is so sort of it's so under kind of tapped into and explored really when it compares to things like nostalgia and others, because I think it is these collections and the serendipity of them in this instance here, or indeed at historic houses. It's that sense of awe of walking into a sort of perfectly maintained and sustained sort of Regency styled room that you just think how extra. It's slightly mind blowing, the whole thing, and I think that sense of awe is what I really believe these historic spaces and places offer today's and dare I say future generations.
A sense of the sublime, a sense of awe. And our cast courts, for example, enormous spaces, and when they were first opened in the 1870s, the reviewers said, "Oh, this is like seeing Mont Blanc." It's like that sense of the kind of, the difference and the majesty of it. And hopefully our storehouse in East London in a different way will also just give that sense of something different and wonderful.
And the storehouse is actually going to, as you said at the beginning, sort of expose essentially the way in which you've held and sustained and maintained these incredible, the excessive kind of collection that the V&A has. Is that really important? Was that a hugely important sort of decision to make, to actually share with people, this is what goes on behind the scenes, this is where everything...
Absolutely. And my colleague, Deputy Director Tim Reeve, has led on this for a decade now. And we were partly inspired by the Boymans, which is a museum and collection centre over in the Netherlands. Louvre Lens sought to do some of this. People want to get behind the scenes. People want to know how a museum works. People want to see conservation and restoration in practice. Mm-hmm. But crucially, what we're also doing there is having a program called Order and Object. So if you want to look at and potentially hold a piece of 18th century Murano glass, you can order that up like you'd order a library book, and then come with a collections care assistant to study it, potentially hold it, look at it. So this sense of radical public access to collections which are owned by the public is part of what we're seeking to achieve. Again, as part of this regeneration story in East London. This was once the largest fridge dump in Europe. And part of the regeneration story of the Olympics was transforming this area. So again, this kind of culture-led regeneration is really important.
Yeah, and fundamentally, I guess, being driven by the number, being driven by the fact you've seen this sort of drive towards, as you say, sort of behind the curtains, and that sense of sort of wanting to switch off and actually feel that real...
Yeah, I mean, the place in a country house you always want to go is where you have the velvet rope and these are the private quarters. You're like, I don't want to go there, I want to go there.
Yeah, I know, it's so true. So if you could go back, Tristram, and give yourself career advice when you're first starting out, what would you be saying to your younger self?
Learn languages. I'm crippled by very poor linguistic abilities, and in this sphere, particularly, the English are hopeless, or the British are hopeless. Our levels of foreign language learning are appalling. Mm-hmm. So keep up and learn. And as you get older, the brain it gets harder. So learning a language young.
Okay, good advice. And after a
Are you learning a language?
I'm not. No, you've already... No, but I have just got back from my first holiday to years in France, and I did actually think, that's it, I'm going to do it. It's going to happen.
But you have to do it now.
You've got to do it. I know, it's true. So after a career devoted to history, what has it taught you about the present and even, dare I say, the future?
How interesting. I think you have this, on the one hand, I mean, it's quite Marxist, but you do have these kind of structural forces in terms of history, which are, not deterministic, but do shape the contours of decision making. But then you also, flipping it, as we're seeing with, Trump or Erdogan or Putin or others, just the individual power and these almost sort of hideous Carlylean great men have this power to reshape history at the same time. So I'm feeling quite depressed at the moment. I'm feeling quite sort of Hobbesian. I'm feeling quite like sort of the chaos of history in its traditional sense is out there at the moment. And I think that sort of sense of like the moral arc and those kind of nice Obama years of generational change towards progressive outcomes feels much less certain now than it did, which is, in the one sense, as it were, history teaches you nothing. But on the other sense, you can feel these almost, I mean, it's not pre-World War I, but you can feel these kind of rhythms of disturbance and chaos taking place again.
Yeah, but and just I have to just ask, only because I'm so curious now that I have you. But is that, to your mind, having studied history so long and then been in politics yourself, is that to discount like the sort of enormous ways of people that are kind of seemingly loving what Mr. Trump is doing, or President Trump is doing, or is it to suggest that it's it's just not No,
it's not to discount them. It's just and you're absolutely right. And and in a few years' time, whether Nigel Farage will be kind of roaring to victory here in the UK, you can't one doesn't discount, as it were, the views behind this, but you're seeing that the consequence of it for someone like me, age 50, growing up in a rules-based international system, and things like the rule of law and the United, all those kind of things we regarded as quite important in terms of the Atlanticist legacy being overthrown. So it feels febrile. It does feel febrile, and it's not going to end with Trump. We're entering a period of kind of change.
Yeah, and if you could ensure that one message about heritage, creativity, design survives for future generations, what would that be?
I think studying the power of the object, and as we face the rise of the robot and the battle of AI, what is human about us, and seeing an object made by humans and connecting to that at a human level with other people as well. We're recording this almost on the anniversary, if not the anniversary, of lockdown. And I remember walking these galleries when they were totally empty. It was quite Miss Havisham as well, because we covered lots of the sculptures in plastic to prevent the dust and things. And, the objects fell silent in a weird way, because you also want to see other people spark in front of the object. And there's a human connection, and there's a human tissue around experiencing galleries and museums. So that holding on to that, even with the screens and even with the brilliance of virtual reality and augmented reality, seems to me important.
Very much so. I completely agree. So Tristram, thank you firstly so much for your time today. I have one final request, which is to share with our listeners your final heritage or historic site or place recommendation for them.
So I would urge listeners, not everyone and not in too many numbers, but to head to Heddon Valley on the North Devon coast, which is located between Coomartin and Linton. And the National Trust look after this landscape incredibly well. And it's one of these, we're now calling them, I think they're now like our rainforests, that we're now calling them these historic woodlands, and I've been going there for 45 years, and it's dramatic, it's spectacular, it's ancient. You feel the sort of echoes of kind of Lorna Dunes sort of thud, and there's a very nice pub called the Hunter's Inn as well. So it's an ancient historic site and landscape, and if you're feeling really brave and you don't mind being smashed up against the rocks, it's quite nice swimming as well. And if you're really lucky, you'll be able to see a couple of dolphins and maybe a seal.
How amazing. What a great recommendation to end on. Well, thank you so much, Tristram, for your time. I know how incredibly busy you are, and I know our listeners will very much appreciate this conversation, so thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure.
Tristram, thank you so much for joining us on Hidden Heritage. It's been an absolute pleasure to hear your insights on one of the most iconic museums in the world, the Victoria and Albert Museum, for which you were the director. As we've learnt today, being the director of a massive multi-site museum, is no mean feat. Before we go, our listeners can follow you on Instagram. You are on Tristram Hunt, and they can also go and explore and discover and find out more about the Victoria and Albert Museum's exhibitions for this year and indeed next at www.vamuseum.ac.uk. And they can also go and check out your book, including the lives of the objects and the radical potter, which explores the history of design and craftsmanship that you discussed with me today on the podcast. Thank you so much to our dear listeners for tuning in to this week's episode with Tristram Hunt. We'll see you very soon on the next one. And in the meantime, be sure to sign up to our newsletter, www.heritageexplorer.com. At our newsletter, you'll find all of the latest exclusive tours of historic houses that are happening up and down the country, all through our platform, Heritage Explore. See you on the next one.